Great. Thanks for joining, everybody. I'm super excited to share with you some thoughts I have on data don'ts. So we have all heard about best practices, and these are some common pitfalls that I have actually seen people do, that I thought I would like to share to our common community, and just some ideas on what to make sure we don't do, and when we're working with data and visualizing data and looking graphically at data, and some considerations on what to do instead. So if you don't mind just going to the next slide for just a second, and then we'll come right back. I want everyone to get their first impressions and back. All right. So we took like a really quick snapshot of the graph. I know it was really hard and you couldn't see everything with that graph. What were some things that caught your attention right away?
The title, the green graph.
The big spike.
Green, what type of graph was it?
Line graph.
A line graph, okay. And it was green, okay. And green, what do we think of when we think of green?
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, good is one.
Also
What's
noticed
another
the-
thing we think of?
Well, I just noticed a big spike.
Big spike. Yep. Saw a big spike. Exactly. So when we think of a big spike, what are some things that we think of? Like if I saw a big spike on a graph and I didn't see the axes, what would I be thinking of?
Something's increasing, something's going up.
Something's maybe pretty volatile, like going up and down. So if you see a line that's really flat, you're probably thinking, oh, there's not a lot of change happening, but you see a big spike and you think there's a lot of change happening. So, all right, if we can advance to the next slide and see what the graph was. All right, so travel expenses by department. So green, we think good, right? In this case, we're talking about expenses. So expenses going up, maybe not so good, right? But green can also be money. So we're looking at expenses, so that can also be the case. Now that we're looking at the actual axes and the actual graph in more detail, what are some things that we notice about this graph?
It has to be a bar graph. It's categories.
You took my final takeaway. No, I'm just kidding. So very good point. And so why should it be a bar graph?
None of them are real. Well, they're not like dependent on each other. So it's each category on its own.
Right. Yeah. So when we're looking at categorical data, we should pretty much never, I'm going to say never, we should never be using a line graph for categorical data, because we're not looking at something over time. What we're looking at is different departments that, as Jessica aptly mentioned, have no relation to one another. So if we use a line graph for this, it shows us, hey, something's increasing or something's going up or something's really volatile, when really these different departments don't have anything to do. They don't have any relationship to one another. So if we could go to the next slide, please. All right, so what to do instead? So in general, make sure you are using an appropriate chart type to display your data. In this case, thank you, Jessica, a bar chart works much better. Line charts should only be used when looking at time and related analyses. All right, on to this. What do we see here? You can stay on the pie graph. All right, so we're going to stay here for a second. We don't need to go back. Just what are some initial takeaways? Like what do you get out of this graph?
It's a bit overwhelming. There's a lot of different percentages and colors, and there's no labels. I mean, that's upsetting. Yeah.
Yep. So pretty overwhelming. You don't really know where to focus your eye. And lots of different sections, lots of different colors, no labels. You basically don't know what you're looking at, right? Any other pickups that anybody has here?
It also seems like it's dominated by the last three areas, like the bottom three areas.
Yeah, that's one. If you were to think of one best practice for a pie graph, just without even looking at this, what would be your one best practice that you would say?
At a bare minimum, add up to 100%.
Needs to add up to 100%. Every single time it needs to add up to 100%. So it always needs to be percentages, and the percentages always need to add up to 100. Here they do not. If you look at 60%, that is not 60%. And it's actually smaller than 23%, which is all kinds of wrong, right? So if we can go to the next slide. Perfect. All right, so this pie chart is not ideal. So what to do instead? Try to limit pie chart splits to no more than 5 areas and colors if you can help it. So ideally 4, I've seen pie charts work best when there's like 2, maybe 3. Make sure you have labels. Colors should not be used more than once. The same color should not be used more than once. You can use gradation if you want to show, for example, if there are different pieces that are part of a set, you can show kind of a gradation, but the same color shouldn't be used more than once. This was a new one that I picked up a couple of years ago. So a best practice that I've heard is you start at the 12 o'clock hour and you put, you can go ahead and do that. Go to the next slide. Perfect. So you can start at the 12 o'clock hour, put your biggest pie piece going clockwise on the 12 o'clock hour, and then the next biggest, and then the next biggest, and then the next biggest, and the next biggest. So really it's going to draw your eye to where the biggest pie slice is there. So that's an example of, there's still no labels here, but that's an example of kind of a better way to draw someone's attention instead of being really overwhelming. So, and pie charts must always sum to 100% every single time. And if there's rounding, put a footnote. So, all right, next slide. All right, Nifty boom fading quickly. I don't know if any of you guys have been following the Nifties and the Nifty boom. This was on Yahoo Finance. This was real. All right, what do we see with this chart?
A bust.
Yeah, you see a bust, right? It goes from like really high to all of a sudden like gone, right? So you see a bust. So if we look at the graph a little more closely, what do we see? Where does the y-axis start?
27K.
So we're not going down to 0.
It goes from the very top tip of the graph to the very bottom tip of the graph, which is, I don't know,
Right.
that just seems wrong.
It does seem wrong. It seems at best misleading.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say that this is an example of perhaps, I mean, at best, a very ineffective way to showcase data. At worst, it's a way of getting data to fit a message that you want it to say, which is never a good thing. So if you could go to the next slide that has the takeaways. All right, so make sure that your axes accurately represent trends in your data. I have heard of cases where it doesn't make sense to have a y-axis that starts at 0, but if you're ever doing that, there should be a very, very good reason for it, and it should always be your default to start the y-axis at 0. Think about how different this graph would have been if we had started the y-axis at 0. It could have had the same takeaway of a fade in Nifty popularity, but it would not have been, I would say, this misleading. So very importantly, the story should fit the data. Do not manipulate the data to tell a particular story. So that is a huge piece of advice that I'm sure you're all doing, but just to make sure, this is, I would say, a very important thing to note and to make sure that you're practicing every single day. Next slide, please. All right, what on earth is going on here?
Too much.
I know, too much. So this is an example. I don't know if how many of you work with dashboards or have heard of dashboards. A dashboard is kind of a way to showcase multiple data points at once. And some people can do them very successfully. And then there are a number of examples. I've heard there are more examples of bad dashboards than good dashboards. This is a real dashboard. If just looking at this, okay, you see London, all right, but then after that, it's just kind of jumble. I mean, even a minute after looking at it, I'm like, what is actually happening here? Your eye doesn't focus in any one place, and you lose the viewer immediately before you even start, and that's never where you want to be. So you can go to the next slide. All right, so what are some better practices? Don't overcomplicate. So I would say a really key point is be intentional about where you want to draw the viewer's eye. So more isn't always better. Where do you want the viewer to focus their eyes? Where do you want the viewer to focus their attention? Sometimes simple makes the most sense, and it really keeps the reader's attention and helps you tell the story with the data. So showing multiple data visualizations can be powerful, but again, there is a balance before it becomes too overwhelming for the viewer. All right, next slide, please. All right, so best practices and data tips. I can't go over all of them, but just for some of the ones that we talked about. So consider what type of graph or graphic will best represent the data. It should always come from a place of what is the data? What type of data am I working with? What is the best type of graphic? Not what I think looks prettiest, not what is most complicated, not what I think is going to be something new with novelty, but what is the best type of graph or graphic that will best represent the data that I'm actually using? Be intentional about where you want to focus, draw focus in a visualization. Let the data guide the story. So again, don't try to fit the data into the story or the narrative, but use the data that you have and see the picture that the data actually has in and of itself, and just use the visualization and the type of graphical representation that is going to tell that story best. Don't overcomplicate it. It can be really enticing and fun to try all these different graph types, but sometimes bar chart is just best. Even though it's simple, it can work best a lot of the time. So, don't, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And then one thing, a little bonus here, data quality is essential. It's not something that I talked about in this presentation very much, but really, I mean, garbage in, garbage out. If you don't have great data quality, then you're just going to have a pretty picture. And what you really want is your data to be able to tell the story. So make sure you know and understand your data really well before you throw it in a pretty picture, no matter how pretty it is. Investigate outliers. So if you see some outliers, make sure that you're investigating them and know why those are. If those are issues with data quality, those are things you need to investigate more. Make sure that you also know if you do have outliers, then you might be throwing off your averages. So you might be losing a lot if you're looking at averages or medians instead of looking at your data as a whole. So those are some quick tips and tricks that I've picked up that I want to make sure that you all have with you when you're knowing and looking at data for yourself and for your positions. Thank you.